Hi there, and welcome to the Modern Mind interview series, where we speak with real people every week who are looking to be and do their best every day. And I'm very lucky to have with me today Julia Hotz, who is an author, a journalist, and a New Yorker who's here to talk not only about her own mental fitness journey, but how she's helping others practice mental fitness every day with her new book. So, with that, Julia, would you tell us a little bit about who you are and your story?
Thank you so much, Lissy. Great to be here. Yeah, I would say, my story is one of not really intentionally going into the space of health, mental health. I joke in my book that when people asked what it was about and I said health and they said like, really? You? I'm just not somebody who's ever been super vocal about that or worn on my sleeves like what I'm doing to practice mental health, that sort of thing. And then in writing the book, I realized that this is strange as a culture. We have these ideas that we associate with health. We think of a healthy person as somebody who eats healthily and works out regularly, and that's certainly true. Those things of course do contribute to health. Somebody who goes to the doctor regularly and can navigate this complicated health system we have. But in writing this book, I realized that actually 80% of what comprises our health is from our social environments. 80% of our health is socially
Oh,
determined. And that depends on things like the kind of meaning we get from our work or our social activities. It depends on how we cope with stress. What are our sources of joy? And once I started realizing that those sort of everyday things are connected to health, I really flipped my own framework and said, we're all on our health journey. I mean, that sounds so cliche, but like we are. It's everything we do in our everyday lives. It's not just the healthy eating, the working out, the going to doctor's appointments. It's how we spend our time and what wakes us up in the morning. So that I could stop there, but that's how I began this. And that's really what my new book, The Connection Cure, focuses on, is how can we leverage healthcare through this new practice called social prescribing to actually connect us to resources and activities in our community that help us create our own health, even those of us like me who are, you know, not your stereotypical like health expert, let's say.
yeah. And I love that you brought that up, Julia, because I think what's really interesting about what you just said is that most people think about health as something you can see. It's the kind of person who looks a certain way and does a certain amount of things and then talks about it. And to
Hmm.
your point, so much of what makes a healthy person are the actual connections between two people, not necessarily something that they're doing on their own.
Right.
Which makes me wonder, like, and I want to hear obviously a lot more about the Connection Cure, as does our community. But can you talk a little bit more about kind of your path here? So you obviously said your friends were surprised, and why. But it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what you were doing to either practice this or what spurred the initial kind of interest in doing the research on this topic that made you realize that you are actually, one of those
Mm.
healthy, secretly healthy people.
Secretly healthy. I love that. Yeah, I guess like most people, the pandemic was a turning point.
Yeah.
I am and was pretty fortunate that in my life, I grew up, I had a great childhood. I had parents who were really supportive. I had a good friend community, all this stuff. And I guess more than I realized, I really depended on my friends and my communities for my well-being. And then during COVID, when that was stripped away from me and from so many of us, we were sort of forced to isolate and socially distance and not have those weekly or daily practices of friendship part of our lives. I really started to feel the effects of it and started experiencing what might be mild symptoms of depression or anxiety, certainly loneliness in that time. And I didn't realize this until much later, because at this time in my whole life, I've been a journalist, and I started exploring this idea of social prescribing from a public health perspective. This idea that so many of us were feeling lonely, And even before the pandemic, I mean, rising rates of mental illness, of loneliness, of stress. Social prescribing emerged as this sort of way to systematically address that by, and I should probably define it for
Yeah,
your
please.
audience, but it's this idea of a health professional, so a doctor, a social worker, a nurse, a therapist, a community health worker, prescribing you activities and resources that are non medical the same way they would prescribe pills and therapies. So, those could be art classes, those could be a hiking group, it could be dinner conversations once a week with this group that meets to do that. I mean, it could really take any form. And the philosophy is about shifting from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. And so to come full circle with that winded answer, I started exploring social prescribing, which began in the UK as a way to sort of address the mental health fallout of everyone after the pandemic. I thought it was really interesting what the research and data was telling us that, yes, this does reduce loneliness. Yes, this does, reduce doctors visits and hospital admissions. But then only after the fact, when I, reported most of this book, I realized I really need this too. When I'm feeling stress, I should prescribe myself nature because the data tells us that this is so good at restoring our attention. When I'm feeling kind of sad or stuck in a negative thought cycle, I need to prescribe myself movement. I go to my running group. When I'm feeling really anxious about something, worried and, can't sleep and 3 a.m. I have these racing thoughts, that's when I know I need an art prescription because art is designed to actually help us shift our thinking. So that's a packing a lot into an answer there. But I think, yeah, for me, it looked like first exploring it as a journalist in the aftermath of the pandemic, and then after reporting on these stories of people who had literally been prescribed, nature for their insomnia or their ADHD, or who were prescribed art for their trauma, I started seeing a little bit of myself in that story. And, as you say, as part of your company, there's a spectrum of illness to wellness. Not everybody has severe bipolar disorder or, severe depression. But some of us at some points in our lives are bound to experience mild symptoms of that. And we can and should use the same tools sometimes to promote wellness, not just address sickness. So yeah, that's that's a lot there.
No, it's so much good stuff, and there's a couple things that I wanted to dive into, which are just like I'd never heard before, which are so cool. And I just have to say, like, this is absolutely so aligned with what we talk about. In that, one of the more interesting and scary facts I learned was that over 80% of all diagnosed cases of depression are episodic. So it's just somebody going through an episode of depressed feeling, thought, or action that lasts longer than
Mm.
2 weeks. And so that
Mm.
feeling that you had during this pandemic, or that I've had plenty of times in my life, where you're just feeling a bit low and you feel a bit stuck, like, is very, very normal. And I love that there's so many of these things that sound not just like interesting, but fun, that could help you
Yeah.
get out of those times. But there's something in particular you said that really struck me, which is that we need to move from away from asking people kind of what's the matter with you to what matters to you. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't know that statistic. That's really interesting. And I should just clarify here, like, I'm a big fan of modern medicine. For somebody who is severely depressed or, severely struggling in any way, it is I believe all options should be available. Social prescriptions are not meant to replace pill prescriptions or any other kind. It's just meant to be
Totally.
another option on the menu. And I'll also say, and I say this in the book, that feeling a little bit sad sometimes is not the same as deep clinical depression. There are a ton of other symptoms. There's a pretty precise diagnostic criteria. It's just that some of us, by virtue of being human in this world, can sometimes approach things that feel like depression. You might overlap with that person who has severe depression on some level. And in those instances, I think a prescription for movement can be really, really helpful. But and that ties to, I think, your question now, which is like, what is the logic behind this shift of what's the matter with you to what matters to you? I think today we have come so far in destigmatizing mental illness. And there's still work to be done, but compared with 50 years ago, I do think there is a greater understanding that lots of people experience things like depression and anxiety. It's not their fault. It's not as simple as just suck it up and get over it. Like, I think 50 years ago, that might have been the case. And now there's such a wider acceptance of it. But what I struggle with a little bit is this idea that we should always be talking about our depression, our anxiety, because what I'd learned in the book was that actually people who see themselves through the lens of their diagnosis are sometimes act in a way that sort of fulfills the criteria of that
Totally.
diagnosis. I'll never forget this man, Jonas, who was diagnosed with agoraphobia and panic disorder and social anxiety, had all these diagnoses, got a lot of help, went on medication, went to therapy, and it really did help him with some of the symptoms. But he said that it got to a point where everyone was always asking him about his anxiety, that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense of,
Interesting.
when he would have a little bit of nervousness about meeting new people, sometimes his mental health professionals and others would say, well, is it because of your anxiety? It's because of your anxiety. And he sort of said, well, I think, anxiety is something that everybody experiences a little bit when they meet new people. There's a lot that can go wrong. And there's a lot in our culture that actually makes that much harder than it used to be. But what social prescribing does is, instead of, like, for example, evidence-backed treatment for social anxiety is exposure therapy. This idea that you expose yourself to that situation that in your head is causing you anxiety, and you realize, hey, this isn't so bad. But for Jonas, just staying on him for an example, what worked for him was, instead of saying, hey, Jonas, you need to go out and meet people to conquer your anxiety, it started with, what did you love to do as a kid? What did you used to love to enjoy? What do you do naturally as sort of a coping mechanism? And it comes out that Jonas is this big reader. He's this big history buff. He
Mm.
has this wild imagination. And so what actually worked for him to treat his anxiety was a culture prescription, a 6 to 8 week, course where he's actually going around to these different cultural activities, museums,
Oh,
art
wow.
classes, concert nights, library read alouds. And yes, he is meeting other people, but he's also doing something he loves. So that scary part becomes a bit, less scary. So that was a long winded way of saying that shift in healthcare, from focusing, and in our culture, from shifting from what's the matter with you to what matters to you, can actually be so powerful for some of our most common ailments. And it's not such a novel idea. It's built on, thousands of years of literature around positive psychology, around the principles of holistic health and integrative medicine. This idea that, you know, um, our health is biopsychosocial. It's not just a matter of what's happening on a chemical level in our bodies. It's also very dependent on what happens in our environment. And if we can shape our environments in a way that makes us feel excited and motivated and passionate and in a state of awe or flow, then we actually are more likely to feel better.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. That is so, so cool. And I'm smiling because I always say that, like, when someone first asked me that question, like, what did you love to do as a kid? For me, it was like cooking, and like I was always baking with my mom, and then also
Mm.
like painting and drawing. So like those were my things, and those are my outlets now as an adult. But I took like a hiatus of 10 years before I realized they're not only like fun for me, but they're good for me. I'm curious, you've talked about art therapy and you've talked about these culture nights. I'm curious, what are some other elements that fall under this social prescription category that you've heard of, that you've written about, that people can kind of listen to say, okay, maybe those things are interesting for you, but maybe, if they're kind of suffering from one of those periods where they're feeling a little down or just looking for something to help them feel a little less anxious and more present, that they could be thinking about too.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I love that, you're not alone. Whenever I start talking about this, people kind of realize, oh, these are the social prescriptions in my life. This is what I do. And painting and art making, that's a big one. I have this website, socialprescribing.co, where I like chronicle all the science behind this. And a big one with painting and art making is the way that it reduces our production of the stress hormone cortisol after just 45 minutes. It's pretty unreal.
Yeah.
But, that website also talks about two things. One is that my book, The Connection Cure, focuses on movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. So across these 5 categories, it pretty much covers like everything we do that is not staying at home in our apartment and isolating and scrolling and, ruminating on our silly little thoughts. It involves everything that involves going out and being part of a community. So for movement, that could be a cycling group, a running group, a walking group, a swimming group. And the book talks about practical examples of this. For nature, if you're someone who is less inclined or less able to move for whatever reason, it could look like fishing. It could look like forest baths. Art, covers so much. I mean, whether it's receiving art, like going to a concert or a museum, or actually being the one who creates the art, writing, sculpture, painting, that's a pretty big category. So on and so forth. All 5 of these things have a number of health benefits, proven health benefits. And in my book, I talk about, movement, for example, as being obviously really good for us, but also in addition to sort of the obvious physical health benefits, our cardiovascular health, our metabolic health, also being tremendously good at improving our energy and mood for the ways that, movement releases serotonin and endorphins and so on and so forth. Nature, I mentioned this earlier, really good at restoring our attention. There's a whole body of literature that talks about the ways nature is uniquely good at sort of resetting our busy brains and restoring
Amazing.
our attention, improving our focus. So that's all true. And on my website, for example, you could say, I'm feeling a little bit blah today, or I'm feeling really distracted this week. I don't know why. Or I'm feeling really grumpy. Whatever it might be, there's like a specific social prescription you can do that counteracts that, given what the science says. But here's the spoiler alert, and I say this in the book too, like all 5 of those things are good for us. And what's almost more important is that it's something you're intrinsically motivated to do. So, for example, you were talking about painting as being something that, really connects you to your childhood and a way to cope with stress now. That would be a great question to ask somebody, is like, what's an activity you turned to as a child that you used to love, but maybe haven't done in 20 years? Or one I like to ask when I do events is about flow. Like, what's something you could do for 5 hours straight and just be totally absorbed in that thing and not be bothered by the other distractions of the world. I'll ask people about when was the last time they experienced awe, like this sort of sense of, wow, the world is so wonderful and amazing. I think asking these kind of questions are really just versions of asking what matters to you, and to maybe
Okay.
translate it into your language, questions of, what makes you feel mentally fit, because it's going to be different for everybody, and probably it will fall along one of these 5 themes. I've yet to meet someone who's said, Yeah, I feel really mentally fit when I am lying down in bed and ruminating on a text I sent and just mindlessly scrolling on my Instagram. Nobody has said that yet. But yeah, like that is what a lot of us do. So I think it just starts with asking the question and helping people think about things in a different way.
I love it. So good and very specific, which is amazing. I'm curious for you, Jules, like what are the like 1 to 3 things that you do on a regular basis that help bring kind of you this joy through the social prescription lens?
Mm. Yeah, so it really depends on what I am going through. I mean, I didn't just choose these five. I chose these five in like sort of categories for a number of reasons. One, like I say in the beginning, our ancestors sort of naturally turned to movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. There's a reason why there's like a whole host of health benefits around those things because we needed to engage with them in order to survive. Um, and in terms of me specifically, I actually genuinely do love all the activities in all five categories. I think before we started recording, you were mentioning that you also had you moved around a lot and you moved your body and you spent time in nature. I had a pretty similar childhood in that sense. So I'm grateful to sort of have all of them at my disposal. But for example, when I'm feeling a little bit just distracted and not focused, is I will go and sit in my favorite park and just look up at the trees. And I having written this book, I know about all of like the very precise benefits that come from doing that. But it is amazing the difference that it makes when I start my day just by getting outside and doing that versus just like, going right into phone and email. It makes a huge, huge difference. So that's one. When I'm feeling anxious about something, I talk about this pretty candidly in the book that my parents are getting older and I have all these like worries about them, unhelpful thoughts at like 3 in the morning. I'm really trying to move more into reading before bedtime. Like these, this again, backed by this science that reading actually can help us shift our perspective. We can get lost in our thoughts in a more productive way. Um, and I realize as I'm listing these are all solitary activities. I think sometimes people hear social prescriptions and they think, oh my gosh, does this mean like I have to spend, all my time with people now? And no, like, of course, all the data is there showing that it's important for us to have strong social relationships, less about quantity, more about quality. And so that would probably be my third thing is just, going on a walk with a friend or having them over for a movie night or going on a bike ride or hike with them. That's probably the biggest one that I rely on is my community here in New York. But also in those quieter moments at like 3 a.m., I'm not going to call my friends and say, let's go for a walk. I have to also rely on sort of these non-medical social prescriptions that I can do on my own terms, on my own time, in my own, home. So those would probably be three, but I could list a dozen.
I love it. And I can definitely relate to that. I also think what's coming up for me when you talked about those two, so like, we'll call them like, singular activities where you're on your own. First is, my aunt once said to me, she said, your job as an adult is to learn to not just like care for yourself, but actually befriend yourself. And I think, as a
Mm.
twin and being one of 4 kids and being a hypersocial extrovert, like I almost over indexed on the social, like the true word of the, like what we think of when we think about social prescription. So it was always like I was feeling bad. I went out and always sought that kind of comfort in others. And as I've gotten older, I've learned that my balance is really in finding like both. It's the relationship and
Yes.
friendship with myself. So I paint alone actually and prefer that. And I do
Ah,
read alone. But to your point, I do a lot of these other things with other people. So like going for walks and making sure that like I'm part of, I've got a running crew. My brother and I work out together. So
I
anyway,
love
can relate to
that.
that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you said that, Lissy. It sounds like we are very similar. We have a lot in
Yes.
common about how we grew
Yes.
up, sort of how we move through the world. And I would say it's even more important for extroverts and people who sort of naturally turn to socialization to keep in mind that stronger connections also include being connected to yourself. I think sometimes for extroverts like us, it's really easy for us to just sort of like go on autopilot. We know that being with our loved ones and being active is something that makes us happy. So we like pack on the schedule and we just sort of go through the motions. And I'm sure that that does bring us great benefits. But I think, especially if that's our natural tendency, it's also important for every single person, regardless of their introversion, extroversion level, to be taking time to connect to yourself. Because ironically, there's some new data that suggests we are spending astronomically more time alone now than we ever have in history. And that's,
Totally.
I think, another leftover relic of the pandemic, remote working. We get all our basic needs met, without having to leave our houses. And yet, I think so many of us don't use that time very wisely. Like we do
Totally.
ruminate and scroll and can just get very caught up in our own thoughts and sort of, I liked a word you said earlier about being present. I think that's what this is really about. Even when we are alone, it's so important that we can be present in the moment
Same.
and do the things that move us closer to a more authentic version of ourselves, someone that, our inner children can recognize, doing things that we're going to remember like 1 year, even 1 week from now. I think it's really easy for us to just like get into the routine of modern living and, forget to take the time that what's the Forrest Gump? Like if you don't, stop and look around, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around, you might miss it.
Yeah, no, I love that one. And yeah, it was crazy because I lived in New York for a total 10 years. I'm in the process of moving out, but the thing I
Mm.
couldn't get over was how people would ask me like, "Oh, what are you doing on a Friday?" And I was very intentionally, especially after I had left, thinking I was so stressed. New York was too crazy for me and moved back and came up with these practices for myself of like spending time going
Mm.
on walks in the city and just looking around. And I would take
Yeah.
photos during the pandemic of something I would see and then write a story about it. So I'd give myself an hour to
Oh,
do that. And like that was like my activity for the
wow.
morning. Because I was alone for like basically a year. And I had all
Yeah.
these little things that I did. And I think what was so interesting is I think a lot about, some people like him, some people don't, but Tony Robbins has this quote about 2 millimeters. Like when you think everything's broken, when you're feeling super lonely, you think like everything has to change. Like I need to be out every night and
Mm.
whatever. And if you're, very extroverted, you might think, oh, I need to spend all my time in. And I think like at the end of the day, it's about finding that 2 millimeter shift in your life. And for me, it was about, taking that time to
Ooh.
walk alone and not be on the phone. And it started there. And then it was writing for an hour. And then it was carving out a little time to paint. So yeah, I think
Wow.
it's like, what I love about this conversation is just um, like the gentle nudge in this direction of joy, which is something
Mm.
that I think people think that you are joyful or you're not. Like you're on vacation and you're joyful or you're at work. And
Yeah.
it's, again, I keep using this word, but it's like permission to do the things that light you up.
Oh,
Um,
yes. Yes. Light you
period,
up. That's
because
exactly
it's
it.
good for you.
Yes.
Julia and the researchers say so. So I love that.
Yeah.
Um, amazing.
Wow. I love lighting up. That's so interesting you say that. Like, that is one of the questions on my website about versions of asking the question, what
Amazing.
matters to you? Like, what makes you light up? And I included that one because when I was interviewing doctors, they used that language. Even in places where English is not the primary language, whatever it was, like it translated to this idea of doctors asking their patients about what makes you light up. In the Netherlands, they say what activates you. um,
Cool.
and absolutely, I wrote that down. If you saw me writing there, it's because I really love that concept of the 2 millimeter shift because I think that's exactly what it is. I think that it can be so burdensome. Life can be just so burdensome. And the task of like feeling better can feel so daunting, but actually, like, it can be really fun, and it can start with little things, as you said. I loved how you put this, that'll just move you in the direction of more joy and more purpose and deeper connections.
Exactly. Oh, thank you. That's so great. So I've got a couple kind of rapid fire questions to wrap up that I
Cool.
typically ask folks. Um, so Julia will obviously make sure that we put all of your details at the end of the podcast so people can grab them and in the show notes. But I am curious, like, is there a book or an article or a podcast that you listen to that like
Mm.
really helped you kind of change the game in the way you thought about any of this?
Yeah, great question. I would say that a book that I actually read during the pandemic, and I recommend it to everybody because I almost think it's like the prequel to The Connection Cure, is this book called Lost Connections by Johann Hari. And
Oh,
that book basically makes the case that yes, cases of depression and anxiety are on the rise. And of course, some of that is, genetic and determined by, factors from our childhood or whatever it might be. But he says actually a lot of it is determined by how we live and the way that we are so disconnected from each other. And whereas my book really focuses on social prescribing as a solution to this, Johann's book really sets up the problem and says, here are the causes of depression in our culture, loss from a, you know, sense of purpose in our work, loss of a sense of community in our religious institutions, loss of, a peer network. He has 9 of them. And then he goes and talks about how different places are addressing it. And he does mention social prescribing, like really briefly, but I should mention that in the time since that book was published, I think I read it in 2019, this movement has just exploded. What started as this tiny, tiny concept in the UK now exists in 32 countries. So I definitely recommend Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections, as a primer.
so cool. Okay, we'll definitely check it out. Um, Next up is what is a piece of life advice or a quote or kind of like a piece of inspiration that you've been living by these days?
Hmm. That is a great question. Okay, well, I'm a big quote on the wall person. I have I think I don't know what it is. Like I grew up with a mother who's very into like decorative signs that have inspirational quotes on them. um
Love it.
and one that she had on her fridge that I now also have on my fridge is this idea of like your playing small does not serve the world. We're all meant to shine as children do. And as we shine our own light, we give others permission to do the same. It's something like that.
Oh, I
um,
love that.
yeah. And it's been important for me because I don't know. I mean, you get it too. You have this podcast, you have this company, and sometimes it can feel like, oh, like who cares what I have to say? This is so me, me, me. I don't want this. Or I don't know. At least for me, I go through that vicious cycle like every day of I cannot believe I'm still posting on social media about this book. But then I come back to that quote and I realize, like, you know what? I really do believe in this stuff. And even if I'm a little annoying, even if people are so sick of this, like, I think that the world will be better if more people do just like wear their heart on their sleeves and, do what they love, because you're playing small doesn't serve us. What does that do in the grand scheme of your life? So that's a quote I'd like a lot.
Oh, very well timed. I also needed to hear that. So I appreciate it. That's great. Okay, last and final question is where can people find you and everything that you're working on?
Yes. So the website I've been referencing throughout this podcast, it's sort of a crowdsourced effort of everyone in the social prescribing movement, is called socialprescribing.co. It has all the research from the book and that I've referenced on this podcast. And also on social media and on my personal website, it's Hotz, my last name, Hotz, thoughts, like the ones you think in your head. That can be helpful or unhelpful
Love.
sometimes. Hot's thoughts. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we'll make sure to put all of that in the show notes. I'm very excited to check out Hotz Thoughts, which is just an incredible handle, one that most of us can only aspire to. This has been
Thanks,
such a
Lizzie.
cool conversation. I'm so, so, so excited for everyone to check out the book and everything that you've been working on. I think there's nothing annoying about reminding people that it's okay to do what they love and what makes them feel good. So thank you for everything you're
Aw.
bringing to the world. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And with that, we'll go ahead and close out this conversation, but hopefully this will open many others for everybody else who's watching.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Back at you. I'm so excited for your new journey, for your new move, for this
Thank
company, for this
you.
podcast. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.